Billionaire CEO forces pregnant ex to sing at wedding. Her voice carried a bombshell that ended the wedding instantly. She stood at the altar where she should have been the bride, her voice trembling with more than just nerves, carrying a secret that would shatter the wedding, and the man who destroyed her. The golden microphone felt like ice in Michelle's hands as she faced the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. Every face in the opulent ballroom belonged to someone who had once called her friend, once smiled at her across boardroom tables, once celebrated her success. Now they stared with the cold politeness reserved for hired help. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across her deep brown skin, and she could feel the weight of her 6-month pregnancy pressing against the too-tight red dress Hector had specifically chosen for her. The same shade of red she'd worn to their first date 3 years ago, when she'd still believed in fairy tales and billionaires with hearts of gold. "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding coordinator announced with practiced cheerfulness, "please welcome Michelle Williams, who will be performing a special song for our happy couple." Happy couple. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Michelle's fingers tightened around the microphone stand as her eyes found Hector across the crowded ballroom. He sat at the head table, his platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, his steel-grey eyes fixed on her with the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. Next to him, his bride, Victoria Sterling, daughter of old money and older grudges, smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. 6 months ago, Michelle had been the one planning a wedding. 6 months ago, she'd been the vice president of marketing at Hector's empire, Sterling Industries. 6 months ago, she believed the man she loved was going to divorce his wife and marry her instead. "I just need more time, beautiful," his voice echoed in her memory, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating. "Victoria's family has significant business ties. I have to handle this delicately." She'd waited. God help her, she'd waited through 3 years of stolen moments, secret vacations, and promises whispered in penthouse suites. She'd waited even when she discovered she was pregnant, even when she'd gathered the courage to tell him about the baby growing inside her. The memory of that night still burned like acid in her chest. She'd worn his favorite blue dress, had prepared his favorite meal, had practiced the words in the mirror until they felt natural. "Hector, we're going to have a baby." His face had gone white, then red, then cold as winter stone. "Fix it," he'd said, not even looking up from his phone. "I know people. Discreet people. I'll make the arrangements." When she'd refused, when she'd placed her hand protectively over her still flat stomach and said, "This is our child, Hector. Our miracle," he'd looked at her with the same expression he wore when firing incompetent employees. "Then you're fired. And if you ever try to contact me again, if you ever try to claim this thing is mine, I'll destroy you. Do you understand me, Michelle? I will obliterate any trace of your existence." The security guards had escorted her out within the hour. Her key card was deactivated, her company credit cards cancelled, her apartment lease, which had been in the company's name, terminated. Within 24 hours, she'd gone from living in a luxury high-rise to sleeping in her sister's spare room in Queens. But even that hadn't been enough for Hector Sterling. He'd made sure she couldn't find work anywhere in New York. Her industry connections dried up overnight. Her LinkedIn profile was mysteriously suspended. Job interviews were cancelled without explanation. He'd used his influence like a weapon, systematically dismantling her career, her reputation, her life. Michelle shifted her weight, the baby kicking as if sensing her distress. She'd been reduced to taking whatever work she could find, singing at small venues, teaching voice lessons to teenagers, working part-time at a music store. The woman who had once commanded 6-figure salaries and flown first class to international conferences now counted quarters to pay for subway rides. And yet, here she was, standing in the most exclusive wedding venue in Manhattan, because Hector Sterling had summoned her. The call had come 3 days ago. Not from Hector himself. He was too important to dirty his hands with such trivial matters. But from his assistant, a cold-voiced woman named Patricia, who spoke as if she were announcing a death sentence. Mr. Sterling requests your presence at his wedding. You'll be performing a song of his choosing. The compensation is $10,000, which we understand you desperately need. Michelle had almost hung up. Almost. But then she'd looked at the stack of unpaid medical bills on her sister's kitchen table, at the eviction notice that had arrived that morning, at the ultrasound photo stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a baby bottle. What song? She'd asked, hating herself for the question. All of Me by John Legend. Mr. Sterling's specific request. He thought you'd appreciate the irony. The irony. Their song. The song he'd hummed while dancing with her in his penthouse. The song he'd said reminded him of how completely she'd captured his heart. Now he wanted her to sing it at his wedding to another woman, like some twisted form of entertainment. But Michelle had agreed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. $10,000 would cover her medical expenses, help her find a new place to live, buy her time to figure out how to rebuild her life. She'd swallowed her pride and agreed to let Hector humiliate her one final time. Now, standing here in the red dress that clung to her pregnant curves, surrounded by the people who had once been her colleagues and friends, Michelle felt the full weight of her degradation. She was here as a curiosity, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to women who forgot their place. Hector raised his champagne glass in her direction, a mocking toast that only she could see. His lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Victoria, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around her perfect day, clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, how wonderful!" the bride exclaimed, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "Hector told me he'd arranged for something special. He said you used to work for the company. Used to work for the company." As if she'd been a secretary instead of the woman who'd helped build Sterling Industries' marketing empire. As if she'd been disposable all along. Michelle nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and she placed her free hand over her stomach. The gesture was subtle, but she saw Hector's eyes narrow as he noticed it. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Good. Let him be reminded of what he'd thrown away. The wedding coordinator, a thin woman with kind eyes, approached with a wireless microphone. "Whenever you're ready, dear," she said softly. "The backing track is all set up." Michelle nodded, accepting the microphone. The weight of it was familiar, comforting even. Before Hector, before Sterling Industries, before everything had gone wrong, she'd been a singer. Not just any singer. She'd been good enough to turn down a recording contract to pursue her MBA. She'd chosen love over music, stability over dreams. Perhaps it was time to remember who she'd been before she'd let a man define her worth. The opening notes of All of Me began to play, and Michelle closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she found Hector's gaze and held it. She'd agreed to sing his song, but she hadn't agreed to sing it his way. "This song," she began, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, "is about giving all of yourself to someone. About loving someone so completely that you lose yourself in the process." She could see confusion flickering across Victoria's face, uncertainty in the posture of the wedding guests. This wasn't how these things usually went. Performers didn't give speeches. They sang and smiled and disappeared. But Michelle wasn't just a performer tonight. She was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "I'm going to sing this song," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Not as it was written, but as it was lived. Because sometimes the most beautiful songs hide the ugliest truths." Hector's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Michelle smiled and began to sing. The first notes Michelle sang were pure, achingly beautiful, exactly as John Legend had written them. The wedding guests relaxed slightly, settling back into their chairs with the satisfied smiles of people who appreciated fine entertainment. Victoria beamed with pleasure, her hand finding Hector's on the pristine white tablecloth. But Michelle's eyes never left Hector's face as she began to weave her own words into the familiar melody. All of me loves all of you. But what happens when all of you isn't real? The slight change in lyrics was so subtle that most of the guests didn't notice. But Hector's face had gone pale, his champagne glass trembling in his grip. Michelle stepped away from the microphone stand, her voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom's acoustics. Her hand rested on her rounded belly as she continued, her voice gaining power with each word. You gave me promises wrapped in lies. Sweet words that covered bitter goodbyes. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the romantic ballad she'd been expecting. Around the ballroom, conversations died as guests began to pay closer attention to the lyrics that definitely weren't from the John Legend song they recognized. 3 years of shadows, 3 years of shame. Playing house while you played your game. What is she doing? Victoria whispered to Hector, but he couldn't answer. His throat had closed completely, his worst nightmare unfolding in real time. Michelle moved closer to the head table, her voice never wavering despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. The lighting caught the moisture on her dark skin, making her seem to glow with an otherworldly power. I gave you everything, my heart, my soul, while you kept me hidden from the world you stole. The ballroom had gone completely silent now, except for Michelle's voice. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen by the raw emotion pouring from the woman in the red dress. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when you're wearing white. Michelle's gaze shifted to Victoria, whose face had gone ashen. The bride's hand flew to her throat, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. You want to know about the woman in red? The one who warmed your husband's bed. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several guests rose from their seats, unsure whether to stay or flee. At the head table, Hector finally found his voice. Stop this. Stop this right now. His words came out as a hoarse whisper, but in the deadly silence of the ballroom, everyone heard them. Michelle smiled through her tears, her voice growing stronger, more defiant. I won't stop, not when I'm just getting started. Not when the truth needs to be heard. She placed both hands on her belly now, the gesture unmistakable in its meaning. This life inside me knows no shame. It carries both our names. Victoria's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves. What is she saying? Hector, what is she saying? But Hector couldn't speak. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and all he could do was watch. 3. Michelle's voice rose to fill every corner of the vast ballroom, carrying with it the weight of 3 years of betrayal, 6 months of suffering, and a lifetime of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. I'm not the only secret you've been keeping. There are others who've been weeping. Other women, other lies, other truths behind your eyes. The wedding guests were on their feet now, some moving toward the exits, others pressing closer to hear every word. Camera phones emerged from designer clutches, capturing the moment when Michelle Williams destroyed Sterling Industries' golden boy. You stole my career, destroyed my name. But you couldn't kill the fire that remains. She was walking toward the head table now, her voice never faltering, each word a surgical strike against the man who had tried to erase her. The company books will tell the tale of bribes and fraud and how you'd fail. If anyone knew where the money went, how much of it was never meant for corporate accounts. Hector shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. Security, he shouted, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. Get her out of here. But the security guards weren't moving. They stood frozen, as transfixed by Michelle's performance as everyone else in the room. Truth had a power that money couldn't buy, and everyone in the ballroom could feel it. The merger with the Koreans last year, built on promises that weren't sincere. The falsified reports, the hidden debt, all the crimes you thought I'd forget. Victoria stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her mouth. My father's company. Hector, tell me she's lying. But Hector's silence was answer enough. Michelle's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room, intimate and devastating. I kept your secrets, kept them safe. Even when you spat in my face. Even when you cast me out. I never spoke, never had doubt. But a mother's love changes everything. It gives broken women wings. The tears were flowing freely now, but Michelle's voice remained steady, powered by a strength she'd never known she possessed. So here's my gift to your new bride. The truth you've worked so hard to hide. Check the Cayman Island accounts. See what your husband's trust amounts. Look at the women who've disappeared, who were silenced by their fear. She turned to face Victoria directly, her voice becoming gentle, almost sisterly. You're not the first to wear his ring, but you could be the last if you're listening. He'll promise you the world and more. But ask him what he did that made the last girl's brother go to war. Victoria's face had gone white as fresh snow. Bradley, she whispered. Bradley Morrison? He said Bradley died in Afghanistan. Michelle's smile was sad but knowing. Check the coroner's report. Check the police files. Check everything he's ever told you, because I promise you, none of it is real. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Even the orchestral backing track had stopped, leaving only the sound of Michelle's voice and the thunder of hearts beating too fast. I came here to sing about love, but love requires truth, and truth is what we've been empty of. So here's my all of me, my final gift. The knowledge that will help you drift away from the man who destroys everything he touches, who leaves behind only crutches, for the women brave enough to stand and tell the world what kind of man Hector Sterling really is. Michelle set the microphone down on the head table with a soft thud that echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Victoria's wedding dress rustling as she swayed on her feet. What do you think drives someone to this breaking point? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Then, like a dam bursting, chaos erupted. Guests surged forward, voices raised in shock and disbelief. Camera phones flashed like lightning. Victoria's father, Senator Robert Sterling, pushed through the crowd with the look of a man who'd just realized he'd been played. But Michelle stood in the center of it all, her hand on her belly, her head held high. She'd delivered her bombshell, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The wedding was over, but for Michelle Williams, the real fight was just beginning. The chaos in the ballroom was unlike anything the Manhattan elite had ever witnessed. Champagne glasses shattered against marble floors as guests scrambled to process what they'd just heard. The carefully orchestrated perfection of Hector Sterling's wedding had devolved into something raw and primal, the sound of a man's empire cracking in real time. Victoria stood frozen at the head table, her designer wedding gown a stark contrast to the devastation written across her face. Her father, Senator Robert Sterling, had pushed through the crowd of guests, his political instincts warring with paternal fury. Victoria, we're leaving. Now. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to controlling damage, but his daughter wasn't moving. Is it true? Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a blade. She was staring at Hector, who had finally found his footing, and was straightening his tie with hands that shook only slightly. Victoria, darling, you can't possibly believe. Is it true? The scream that tore from Victoria's throat silenced the entire ballroom. Her carefully applied makeup ran in dark rivers down her cheeks, and her bouquet lay forgotten on the floor, white roses scattered like fallen snow. Hector's jaw tightened. This was damage control time, and he'd built his fortune on his ability to spin disasters into opportunities. She's a disturbed woman, Victoria. A disgruntled former employee who's carrying your child. Victoria's words weren't a question. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the flat certainty of someone whose world had just imploded. Michelle watched the exchange from beside the wedding cake, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. She'd done it. She'd finally told the truth. But now she had to live with the consequences. Around her, the wedding guests were dividing into camps. Some pushed toward the exits, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that was sure to follow. Others lingered, drawn by the same morbid fascination that made people slow down to stare at car accidents. The society photographers who had been hired to capture the Sterling wedding were now documenting its destruction, their cameras clicking like hungry insects. Michelle. The voice came from behind her, soft and familiar. She turned to find her former colleague, Jennifer Martinez, approaching with cautious steps. They'd been friends once, before Hector's influence had made associating with Michelle toxic. Jen. Michelle's voice was hoarse from singing, from crying, from finally speaking her truth. Is everything you said true? Jennifer's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The Korean merger, the Cayman accounts, Bradley Morrison? Michelle nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Every word. I have documents, recordings, proof of all of it. I've been gathering evidence for months. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Why wait until now? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Michelle looked across the ballroom at Hector, who was now engaged in heated conversation with Victoria's father. Both men wore the expressions of politicians, trying to craft a narrative that would salvage their reputations. Because I was still hoping. Michelle's voice broke slightly. God help me. I was still hoping he'd do the right thing. That he'd claim his child. That he'd acknowledge what we'd meant to each other. I thought maybe if I proved I wasn't going to disappear quietly, he'd realize that destroying me was destroying a part of himself. Jennifer's expression softened. And now I know that the man I loved never existed. He was just another one of Hector's carefully constructed lies. Michelle straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the life growing inside her. But this baby deserves better than a father who would rather commit fraud than claim his own blood. The sound of shattering glass drew their attention back to the head table. Victoria had swept her water glass to the floor, her chest heaving with the kind of rage that came from having your entire future ripped away in a single moment. 3 years. Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. 3 years you were sleeping with her while planning our wedding, while I was choosing flowers and tasting cake, and picking out china patterns. Victoria, please not here. Not in front of everyone. Hector's voice carried a note of desperation that Michelle had never heard before. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not here. Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. You didn't mind having your pregnant mistress sing at our wedding, but you want privacy now? You want to discuss this like civilized people. She was advancing on him now, her wedding dress rustling with each step. The guests had formed a loose circle around the unfolding drama, their phones capturing every moment for posterity. You made her sing our song. Our song, Hector. The one you said would be playing when we danced at our wedding. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her screaming. How long have you been planning this humiliation? How long have you been laughing at me behind my back? It wasn't like that. Don't. Victoria held up a hand, her engagement ring catching the light from the chandeliers. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I heard every word she sang. I saw her face when she looked at you. A woman doesn't carry that kind of pain unless she's loved deeply and been destroyed completely. Michelle felt tears prick her eyes at Victoria's words. Even in her own devastation, the other woman had recognized the truth that so many people had missed. That what Michelle had felt for Hector had been real, even if his feelings hadn't been. Victoria, darling, we can work through this. Work through this. Victoria's laugh was hollow. You committed fraud. You killed a man. You impregnated your employee, and then destroyed her life to cover it up. What exactly are we working through, Hector? Which felony should we start with? The mention of murder sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. Several more guests headed for the exits, unwilling to be associated with whatever was about to unfold. Hector's mask was finally slipping. The polished businessman was giving way to something darker, more desperate. Bradley Morrison was a drunk who got himself killed in a bar fight. If people want to create conspiracy theories, I have the autopsy report. Michelle's voice cut through his excuse like a sword. All eyes turned to her as she reached into her purse and withdrew a manila folder. And the police report. And the witness statements that were mysteriously lost. And the coroner's notes about the unusual bruising patterns that were inconsistent with a bar fight. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving, everyone frozen by the gravity of what was unfolding. Bradley Morrison discovered the Korean merger was built on falsified environmental reports, Michelle continued, her voice gaining strength. He was going to expose how Sterling Industries had bribed officials to overlook contamination that would have killed thousands. So you had him killed and made it look like a random act of violence. That's impossible. Victoria's father had gone pale beneath his political tan. The environmental clearances were. I signed off on those reports myself. Based on falsified data, Michelle replied. Data that your future son-in-law provided to ensure the merger went through. The real environmental reports are in the Cayman accounts, along with records of every bribe paid and every official compromised. Senator Sterling's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. His political career, his reputation, his family's legacy, all of it was crumbling because of his association with Hector Sterling. You son of a bitch, he breathed, turning on Hector with violence in his eyes. You made me an accessory to murder. Robert, please. Don't you dare speak to me. The senator's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent decades wielding power. Security will escort you out of this building. My lawyers will be in touch about annulling this marriage before it's even consummated. And if you ever come near my daughter again, I'll have you arrested for harassment. But Victoria was already moving, her hands working frantically to remove her engagement ring. The massive diamond caught the light as she pulled it from her finger and held it up for everyone to see. This ring, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, was bought with blood money. This whole wedding, this whole life you promised me, it was all built on lies and murder and the destruction of innocent women. She turned to face Michelle, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what he did to you. For what he put you through. For what he made me an unknowing part of. Michelle felt her own tears threaten to spill over. You didn't know. You were as much a victim as I was. But I should have known. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. I should have seen the signs. I should have questioned why a man like him would suddenly want to settle down, why he was so secretive about his business dealings, why he always seemed to have an excuse for everything. She walked to where Michelle stood, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. Up close, Michelle could see that Victoria was younger than she'd appeared from across the room. Probably no more than 25, with the kind of sheltered innocence that money could buy. How far along are you? Victoria asked softly. 6 months. Michelle's hand moved to her belly. It's a girl. Victoria's face crumpled. He's going to have a daughter, and he tried to make you disappear rather than claim her. Some men aren't meant to be fathers, Michelle replied. And some children are better off without them. The two women stood facing each other in the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of Victoria's life, connected by their shared experience of loving a man who was incapable of love. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a completely different life? How did you handle the revelation? Behind them, Hector was backing toward the exit, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. His empire was crumbling, his marriage was destroyed, and the woman he'd tried to silence was standing in the center of his world, very much alive and very much ready to fight. But Michelle wasn't done. Not yet. She still had one more card to play, one final truth that would ensure Hector Sterling never hurt another woman again. Hector, she called out, her voice carrying across the ballroom with absolute authority. Where are you going? We're not finished yet. He froze in the doorway, his shoulders tensing. When he turned back to face her, Michelle saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before, genuine fear. I have more to say, she continued, her voice steady and sure. And I think everyone here deserves to hear it. The ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the next revelation that would surely bring down one of New York's most powerful men. Michelle smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes. Hector Sterling had built his empire on the principle that information was power, and power was everything. For 15 years, he'd carefully cultivated an image of respectability while systematically destroying anyone who threatened to expose the truth. He'd silenced whistleblowers, bought politicians, and eliminated obstacles with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing cancer. But standing in the doorway of his ruined wedding, facing the woman he'd tried to erase, Hector realized that he'd made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that destroying Michelle's career and isolating her from her support network would be enough to keep her quiet. He'd never imagined that pregnancy would give her the strength to fight back. "Michelle, please." His voice carried across the ballroom with a note of desperation that made his remaining guests shift uncomfortably. "You've made your point. You've humiliated me, destroyed my marriage, ruined my reputation. Isn't that enough?" Michelle's laugh was soft, but carried a razor's edge. "Enough? Hector, we haven't even gotten to the good part yet." She moved toward the center of the ballroom, her hand resting on her belly, her voice projecting with the confidence of someone who'd finally found her power. "You see, when you destroyed my life, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed I'd be too broken to fight back. But you forgot that I'm not just fighting for myself anymore." The baby kicked as if responding to her words, and Michelle's smile widened. "You forgot that a mother's love makes women dangerous." Victoria, still standing in her ruined wedding dress, watched the exchange with growing fascination. Her father had moved to her side, his political instincts warring with his paternal protectiveness, but Victoria's attention was entirely focused on Michelle. "What else?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What else did he do?" Michelle reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope, holding it up for everyone to see. "This contains copies of documents I've been gathering for the past 6 months. Bank records, email correspondence, recorded phone calls, witness statements. Everything needed to prove that Hector Sterling is not just a fraud and a murderer, but a predator who's been using his position to systematically abuse women for years." The gasp that rippled through the ballroom was audible. Several guests who'd been moving toward the exits stopped and turned back, drawn by the promise of even more devastating revelations. "You're bluffing," Hector said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the ballroom's air conditioning. "Am I?" Michelle's smile was serene. "Jessica Chun, your former assistant. She disappeared suddenly 2 years ago after filing a sexual harassment complaint with HR. You paid her $2 million to relocate to Singapore and sign a non-disclosure agreement. But NDAs don't cover criminal activity, and Jessica's been waiting for someone to give her the courage to speak up." She opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "This is a sworn affidavit from Jessica detailing how you raped her in your office, and then threatened to destroy her family's restaurant business if she reported it. She's agreed to testify in court." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving, frozen by the gravity of what was unfolding. "That's not all," Michelle continued, her voice gaining strength. "Rebecca Torres, your former marketing director. She resigned abruptly 3 years ago after what you claimed was a personality conflict. In reality, she caught you embezzling funds from the cancer research charity the company sponsored. You forced her to stay silent by threatening to have her mother deported." Victoria's face had gone ashen. "The Aurora Foundation? That's my mother's charity. She died of cancer when I was 12. You used her memory to steal money." Hector's composure was cracking visibly. "Victoria, I can explain." "Explain what?" Victoria's voice was rising again. "How you used my dead mother's charity to fund your criminal activities. How you raped women and threatened their families. How you've been lying to me about everything since the day we met." Michelle wasn't finished. She withdrew another document from the envelope, this one bearing official letterhead. "This is a copy of the FBI investigation into Sterling Industries that was mysteriously shut down 18 months ago. The agent in charge, Detective Marcus Rivera, was suddenly reassigned to a desk job in Montana after getting too close to the truth. But he kept copies of everything, and he's been waiting for the right moment to reopen the case." The mention of the FBI sent a visible shockwave through the remaining guests. Several of them were now actively backing toward the exits, unwilling to be associated with what was clearly about to become a federal investigation. "You're destroying innocent people," Hector said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "These guests, Victoria, her family, they don't deserve to be dragged into this." "You should have thought of that before you made me sing at your wedding," Michelle replied coldly. "Before you tried to humiliate me one last time. Before you decided that destroying my life wasn't enough, you wanted to parade me around like a trophy." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the ballroom. You wanted to show everyone that you could break me completely, that you could make me perform for your pleasure, even after everything you'd done. But what you didn't realize is that some women get stronger when they're broken. The baby kicked again, and Michelle's hand moved to her belly with protective instincts that had been forged in the fire of abandonment and betrayal. This child will never know her father, she continued. But she'll know that her mother was brave enough to speak truth to power. She'll know that when faced with a choice between safety and justice, her mother chose justice. Victoria was crying now, her makeup completely destroyed, her wedding dress stained with tears and champagne. But there was something else in her expression, a kind of fierce admiration for the woman who'd found the strength to fight back. I want to help, Victoria said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. Whatever you need, testimony, evidence, financial support, I want to help bring him down. Victoria, no, her father started, but she cut him off with a look. Don't. Just don't. Her voice carried an authority that neither Michelle nor Hector had heard before. I've spent my entire life being protected from reality, sheltered from consequences. But I'm not a child anymore, and I won't be complicit in this man's crimes. She turned to face Michelle directly. You said you have evidence of the Korean merger fraud. My signature is on those environmental reports. I'll testify that I was deceived, that the data I approved was falsified. I'll take responsibility for my part in it. Victoria, that could destroy your political career before it even starts, her father warned. Good, Victoria replied simply. If my career is built on lies and corruption, then it deserves to be destroyed. Michelle felt tears prick her eyes at Victoria's words. This was what courage looked like, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite the cost. There's more, Michelle said softly, withdrawing the final document from her envelope. This is a paternity test. Hector demanded one when I told him I was pregnant. He wanted scientific proof that he couldn't deny. She held up the document for everyone to see. According to this test, there's a 99.9% probability that Hector Sterling is the father of my child. He's known for 6 months that he has a daughter on the way, and he's done everything in his power to pretend she doesn't exist. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Guests surged forward, their phones out, their voices raised in shock and outrage. The society photographers were having a field day, their cameras capturing every moment of Hector Sterling's complete destruction. But Michelle wasn't paying attention to the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Hector, who had backed against the wall like a cornered animal. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked exactly like what he was, a small, frightened man who'd used his power to hurt people weaker than himself. You destroyed my career, Michelle said, her voice carrying over the chaos. You isolated me from my friends, made me a pariah in my own industry. You tried to force me to terminate my pregnancy, and when I refused, you threw me out like garbage. She was walking toward him now, her voice gaining power with each step. But the worst thing you did, the thing I'll never forgive, is that you made me doubt myself. You made me question whether I was worthy of love, whether I deserved better, whether I had the right to exist in the same world as you. The baby kicked again, and Michelle's hand moved protectively to her belly. But this child changed everything. She gave me a reason to fight, a reason to be brave, a reason to demand justice not just for myself, but for all the women you've hurt. Hector's back was literally against the wall now, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. What do you want? He whispered. Money? A settlement? I can make this all go away. Michelle's smile was sad but resolute. I don't want your money, Hector. I want justice. And I want you to know that the woman you tried to destroy is the same woman who's going to bring you down. The sound of sirens outside the ballroom windows made everyone freeze. Through the ornate glass, they could see police cars and FBI vehicles pulling up to the hotel's entrance. I called them before I came here tonight, Michelle said quietly. I gave them copies of everything, the documents, the recordings, the witness statements. They're not here to arrest me, Hector. They're here for you. The doors to the ballroom burst open, and federal agents flooded in, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The wedding guests scattered like startled birds, but the agents moved with practiced efficiency toward their target. "Hector Sterling, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Hector's wrists, Michelle felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. The man who'd tried to erase her was finally facing consequences for his actions. But the moment that would stay with her forever came when Victoria approached her one final time, her ruined wedding dress trailing behind her like a symbol of everything she was leaving behind. "Thank you," Victoria said simply. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. Thank you for saving me from a lifetime of lies." Michelle reached out and took Victoria's hand, feeling the weight of shared experience and mutual respect. "We saved each other," Michelle replied. "That's what strong women do." What would you have done in Michelle's situation? Would you have had the courage to speak up, or would you have stayed silent? Let me know in the comments. As Hector was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling around him, Michelle stood in the center of the ballroom with her hand on her belly and her head held high. The woman who'd walked in as hired entertainment was leaving as a hero who'd brought down one of New York's most powerful predators. The baby kicked once more, and Michelle smiled through her tears. Her daughter would grow up in a world where her mother had fought for justice and won. And that was a legacy worth more than all of Hector Sterling's blood money combined. 6 months later, Michelle stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new apartment, watching the sunrise paint the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and rose. In her arms, her 3-month-old daughter, Grace, slept peacefully, her tiny fist curled around Michelle's finger with the unconscious trust that only babies possessed. The apartment was modest by Manhattan standards, a 2-bedroom in Brooklyn Heights that Michelle had purchased with the settlement money from Sterling Industries' bankruptcy proceedings. It wasn't the penthouse she'd once shared with Hector, but it was something far more valuable. It was hers, bought with her own money, a symbol of the life she'd built from the ashes of her destruction. The morning news played softly on the television behind her, and Michelle smiled as she heard the familiar refrain that had become the soundtrack of her vindication. Former billionaire Hector Sterling was sentenced today to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. The conviction stems from revelations that emerged during his wedding 6 months ago, when former employee Michelle Williams exposed a pattern of criminal behavior that had been hidden for years. Justice had been swift and thorough. The FBI investigation that Detective Rivera had been forced to abandon had been reopened with a vengeance, and the evidence Michelle had gathered had provided the foundation for one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime prosecutions in recent memory. Jessica Chun had flown back from Singapore to testify about the sexual assault, her voice steady and strong as she described how Hector had used his power to silence her. Rebecca Torres had returned from exile to detail the charity fraud, her testimony revealing how Hector had stolen over $3 million from cancer research in Aurora Sterling's name. But perhaps the most devastating testimony had come from an unexpected source, Victoria Sterling, who had stood in federal court and described how she'd been manipulated into signing environmental reports that had led to contaminated water supplies in 3 Korean cities. Her courage in taking responsibility for her unwitting role in the fraud had earned her immunity from prosecution and widespread admiration for her integrity. The Korean government had filed criminal charges of their own, and the families of the contamination victims had won a civil judgment that had stripped Hector of his remaining assets. Bradley Morrison's family had finally received justice for their son's murder, and the $50 million judgment they'd won had been donated to establishing a foundation for whistleblower protection. Michelle's phone buzzed with a text message, and she smiled as she read it. "How's my goddaughter today? V." Victoria Sterling, who'd legally returned to her maiden name of Victoria Aurora Morrison in honor of her mother, had become an unlikely but treasured friend. The shared trauma of Hector's betrayal had forged a bond between them that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. 8. Victoria had used her inheritance to establish the Aurora Foundation for Women's Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting women who'd been silenced by powerful men. She'd asked Michelle to serve as the organization's first director, and Michelle had accepted with the understanding that she could work from home while Grace was young. "She's perfect, as always. Are we still on for lunch?" Michelle typed back, "Absolutely. I have news." Michelle's curiosity was piqued, but before she could respond, Grace stirred in her arms, her dark eyes, so like her father's, though Michelle chose to focus on their beauty rather than their source, opening to gaze up at her mother with perfect trust. "Good morning, beautiful girl," Michelle whispered, pressing a kiss to Grace's forehead. "Did you sleep well?" Grace responded with a yawn and a stretch, her tiny fist bumping against Michelle's chin. The gesture was so endearing that Michelle felt her heart swell with the overwhelming love that had become her constant companion since her daughter's birth. Motherhood had been everything she'd hoped for and nothing she'd expected. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the way her heart seemed to exist outside her body now. It was exhausting and terrifying and absolutely perfect. Grace had given her a purpose beyond justice, beyond revenge, beyond even her own healing. She was raising a daughter who would grow up knowing that women could be strong, that truth was more powerful than money, that love was worth fighting for. The apartment's intercom buzzed, and Michelle frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone this early. "Ms. Williams? There's a Jennifer Martinez here to see you," the doorman announced. Michelle's breath caught. Jen had been her closest friend at Sterling Industries, but like so many others, she'd distanced herself when Michelle had been fired. They'd spoken briefly at the trial, but this was the first time Jen had reached out personally. "Send her up," Michelle said, her voice tight with emotion. 5 minutes later, Jennifer Martinez stood in Michelle's doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears and her arms full of baby gifts. "I'm sorry," Jen said without preamble. "I'm so sorry for abandoning you when you needed me most. I was scared, and I was selfish, and I let fear make me a coward." Michelle felt her own tears threatening. "Jen. No, let me finish. I watched you destroy your life, rather than stay silent about what was right. I watched you risk everything to protect other women, and I was too afraid to even return your phone calls. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm hoping." "Come here," Michelle said softly, shifting Grace to one arm and pulling Jen into a hug with the other. "You're here now. That's what matters." They held each other for a long moment. Two women who'd found their way back to friendship through the wreckage of betrayal and fear. "She's beautiful," Jen said, gazing down at Grace with wonder. "She looks just like you." "Thank God," Michelle replied with a laugh. "I was worried she'd have her father's." She stopped, realizing she'd mentioned Hector. "It's okay," Jen said gently. "You can talk about him. He's her father, even if he's a monster. She's going to have questions someday." Michelle nodded, grateful for Jen's understanding. "I'll tell her the truth when she's old enough to understand it. That her father was a man who made terrible choices, but that doesn't define her. That she was born from love, even if that love was misplaced. And that her mother is a hero," Jen added. "Don't forget that part." They spent the morning catching up, with Jen sharing news from their former colleagues, and Michelle describing her new life. Many of their old co-workers had reached out after the trial, offering apologies and support. Some had even provided additional evidence of Hector's crimes, helping to ensure that justice was thorough and complete. "I have something for you," Jen said, reaching into her purse. She withdrew an envelope bearing the logo of Hartwell and Associates, one of New York's most prestigious marketing firms. "What's this?" "A job offer. Marcus Hartwell wants to meet with you about becoming a senior partner. He says what you did took more courage than anyone in the industry has shown in decades, and he wants that kind of integrity on his team." Michelle stared at the envelope in disbelief. 6 months ago, she'd been unemployable, blacklisted from her own industry. Now she was being offered a partnership at one of the most respected firms in the city. "I told them you might not be interested," Jen continued, "given everything you've been through, and with the Aurora Foundation work. But Marcus said the offer stands whenever you're ready." Michelle felt tears prick her eyes. Not just because of the professional vindication, but because of what it represented, the complete restoration of everything Hector had tried to take from her. Her career, her reputation, her future. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing this to me, for coming back, for being brave enough to be my friend again." "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like," Jen replied. After Jen left, Michelle prepared for her lunch with Victoria, dressing Grace in the pale yellow outfit that brought out her daughter's golden undertones. The restaurant Victoria had chosen was a small bistro in Greenwich Village, far from the society haunts where they might once have been photographed. Victoria was already seated when Michelle arrived, her face glowing with excitement and something that looked suspiciously like love. "You look happy," Michelle observed, settling Grace's carrier beside their table. "I am happy," Victoria replied, unable to suppress her smile. "I'm in love." Michelle's eyebrows rose. "With who?" "Detective Rivera. Marcus. He's been working with the Aurora Foundation as a consultant, helping us develop our whistleblower protection protocols. And somewhere between reviewing case files and planning security procedures, She trailed off, her cheeks flushing. "Victoria, that's wonderful." Michelle reached across the table to squeeze her friend's hand. "Tell me everything." Victoria's story tumbled out in a rush of excitement and joy. How Marcus had been professional and respectful at first. How their working relationship had gradually deepened into friendship. How he'd asked her to dinner just last week, and she'd said yes without hesitation. "He's nothing like Hector," Victoria said, her voice soft with wonder. "He's honest and kind and genuinely good. He doesn't care about my money or my connections. He just sees me. The real me." Michelle felt her heart swell with happiness for her friend. Victoria had emerged from the wreckage of her wedding stronger and more authentic than she'd ever been. The sheltered society princess had become a fierce advocate for justice, and now she was finding love with a man who valued her character over her pedigree. "I'm so happy for you," Michelle said sincerely. "You deserve someone who sees your worth." "So do you," Victoria replied, her gaze meaningful. "Marcus has a partner, Detective Sarah Chun, Jessica's cousin, actually. She's single, brilliant, and she's been asking about you." Michelle laughed, shaking her head. "I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe someday, but right now, Grace and I are perfect just as we are." "Of course you are," Victoria agreed. "But when you are ready, you'll have women lining up to date the hero who brought down Hector Sterling." They talked for hours, sharing dreams and plans, and the comfortable intimacy of women who'd survived trauma together. Grace slept peacefully through lunch, occasionally stirring to accept a bottle or smile at the women who'd helped shape her mother's new life. As they prepared to leave, Victoria handed Michelle a small gift box. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a phoenix rising from flames. The inscription on the back read, "For Michelle, who showed us all what it means to rise." Michelle felt tears blur her vision. "It's beautiful." "You're beautiful," Victoria replied. "Inside and out. Don't ever forget that." That evening, Michelle sat in her daughter's nursery, rocking Grace to sleep while humming softly. The walls were painted a warm yellow, decorated with inspirational quotes about strength and courage. Above the crib hung a mobile of paper cranes, each one inscribed with a wish for Grace's future. "Dream big, little one. Be brave. Be kind. Be true to yourself." As Grace's breathing deepened into sleep, Michelle allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, she'd been broken and desperate, forced to sing at the wedding of the man who'd destroyed her. Tonight, she was whole and hopeful, surrounded by love and opportunity. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, and Michelle smiled as she read the headline. Hector Sterling transferred to federal supermax prison after threats against former employees. Justice had been served, completely and thoroughly. Hector would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes, while the women he'd hurt had been given the chance to rebuild and heal. Michelle's story had become a symbol of hope for women everywhere. Proof that even the most powerful men could be held accountable, that truth could triumph over money, that love could conquer fear. She'd received hundreds of letters from women, sharing their own stories of survival and courage. Some had been inspired to report their own assaults. Others had found the strength to leave abusive relationships, and many had simply found hope in the knowledge that they weren't alone. Michelle had saved them all, planning to share them with Grace someday as evidence of the ripple effect that courage could create. I want to hear from you. What's one moment in your life when you found the courage to speak your truth, even when it was scary? Share your story in the comments and inspire others with your bravery. As she placed Grace in her crib and kissed her daughter's forehead, Michelle whispered the words that had become her nightly prayer. You are loved, Grace Morrison Williams. You are wanted. You are enough. And you come from a line of women who refuse to be silenced. The baby stirred slightly, as if responding to her mother's voice, and Michelle smiled through her tears. Outside, the city sparkled with infinite possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference in the world. But tonight, Michelle was exactly where she belonged. Home with her daughter, surrounded by love, victorious in every way that mattered. The woman who'd been forced to sing at her destroyer's wedding had found her voice, and used it to change the world. And in doing so, she discovered that sometimes the most beautiful songs were the ones born from the deepest pain. Grace's first word would be mama, and Michelle would teach her that the most powerful word in any language was no, the word that had saved them both and brought a monster to justice. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, and her song would echo through generations of women who refused to be silenced.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.